Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by thebigfouraccountingfirms.com. Check out our blog and subscribe to our podcast for career advice, recruiting secrets, and the latest Big Four news. Hope you enjoy the show.
In today's podcast, we're going to be covering the big news about E&Y and AIG. I'm going to be going over the details of the deal, and then I'm going to tell a story or a couple stories to provide some real-world insight into why this deal is happening. I'm going to save the advice and actionable steps coming from this deal for our Patreon listeners. So check out the show notes to get the link to our Patreon page where you can get actionable Big Four career tips and recruiting advice for as little as $1. Okay, so let's get to this news story. On February 5th, 2018, E&Y formed a partnership with AIG, and they've termed it a new innovative global tax compliance and technology operating agreement. It involves a combination of managed tax services, meaning that E&Y will help manage AIG's tax department, and there will also be some AIG tax department employees that move over to Ernst & Young. And this partnership between AIG and Ernst & Young will last for 5 years. And AIG is one of the largest insurance companies in the world. And at one point, they were one of the largest companies in the world overall, and they had one of the largest tax departments as well. They have hundreds of tax professionals in their tax department, similar to GE. Now, this is a similar deal to what GE did with PwC back in April of 2017, which is over a year ago now, where PwC acquired GE's tax department. And in that deal, PwC acquired GE's tax department for a 5-year term as well, where they took on 600 of GE's employees. And in that deal, PwC also signed a 5-year contract, similar to what AIG and E&Y signed here. The employees moving over to Ernst & Young will focus on the compliance obligations of AIG, while the people that are left at AIG will focus on more strategic initiatives. And I'm sure that's more like tax planning and other tax legal obligations. So behind all the fancy words and press releases, what does this actually mean? This means that AIG is outsourcing their tax department to Ernst & Young for 5 years, or they're at least outsourcing pieces of their tax department. And if they like the terms of the deal and the work they receive, then they will most likely make the deal permanent, or at least extend it. You have to remember that Ernst & Young and the employees from AIG that are moving to Ernst & Young will be performing tax compliance services for AIG. What Ernst & Young plans to do is to utilize the knowledge they gained from working inside of AIG to win more work at other clients and within AIG. Okay, so now I want to provide some more insight into why companies are becoming more interested in managed services by telling a couple of stories. But first, I wanted to provide some background. Why is this deal happening? This deal is primarily happening because these large organizations are tired of paying so many employees for minimal output. They likely overhired back when they were performing really well and their operations were booming. But now both companies are declining. AIG has growth every year, but it's not what people expect, and GE is all in the headlines with all the issues they're having. So both of these companies need to cut costs and scale back. However, they don't want to do the downsizing and cost management themselves, so they are willing to outsource that to the Big Four. But why would they do that? They do this because of headline risk. Firing employees does not look good in the headlines of global newspapers like the Wall Street Journal. But if you move those employees over to the Big Four, then the headline becomes AIG enters a strategic deal with large accounting firm, or GE enters a strategic deal with large accounting firm. Yes, AIG still has to pay E&Y hefty fees, but AIG will no doubt lower the fees for this deal as the years go on. And the best part of that, if you're AIG, is that you don't have to tell Ernst & Young up front that you want to lower their fees later on. So when AIG does end up lowering the fees, those historic AIG employees that moved over to Ernst & Young will likely be forced out of E&Y because they can't support keeping them on the payroll. So Ernst & Young will likely let those people go or tell them to leave. And therefore, AIG has outsourced the firing or laying off of these employees to Ernst & Young. And when that happens, the Wall Street Journal won't be interested in running a story about AIG lowering fees to E&Y. That's not headline news. People lower fees to contractors all the time. But they would love to run a story about AIG performing mass layoffs. So that's why AIG does not want to do that. Layoffs are bad for company brands and they are bad for employee morale. So AIG wants to avoid that. Same with GE. I say all that to say this. The reason large companies like GE and AIG are entering deals like this one is because older employees aren't as valuable as younger employees due to changes in technology. What do you think the average age of an employee at AIG is? 26, 35? I bet it's well over 40. while the average age of a Big Four employee is around 26 or 27 because they hire so many college recruits. It's not only the technology that makes younger people more valuable to AIG also. It's the salary. The salary of a Big Four employee is significantly less than someone with 20 years of experience. Therefore, the fees associated with those employees are probably even lower than the salaries of the historical AIG employees. But with that being said, I don't want to get too far away from how technology can replace these older employees, because I want to tell a story around that. One of the big reasons companies like AIG and GE are doing these types of deals is because younger people know way more about technology than older employees at both of these companies. Don't get me wrong, there are people at both companies that are likely software coders and tax technology people, but the average tax person at GE and AIG knows way less about technology than young people at the Big Four. For this reason, companies are willing to do deals like this. They also know that younger people are willing to learn more about technology than older people. And technology is capable of completing way more work than one person can. And this is where I want to get into a couple stories to provide some background and insight into this deal. When you think about working at the Big Four or in the accounting industry, you think about using fancy new technologies like automation and robotics and blockchain. But you have to remember, there's still a lot of baby boomers and Gen Xers in the workforce, and especially in the accounting industry, because the accounting industry is an old industry. And I've recently worked with two professionals who were both over 60 years of age. And one of them preferred tying out every single number by hand in huge paper binders. And the other viewed himself as a technology guy. But the technology guy's knowledge of technology included being able to use Excel, and that's about it. But that's not to say these people are useless or that they were useless. Both of these guys were needed back in the day. The paper binder guy was needed because that's how things were documented back in the day. And it's not even that far back in the day either. This is less than 10 years ago that the majority of audit work and tax return work was completed in binders. You had to put all of your work into a big binder, and then you had, after you were completed with the project, you had to archive that binder in a storage facility. And if you wanted to access prior year data, you had to call up that binder, and somebody had to go get it from a storage room, or a storage facility had to ship it to you, or you had to get it out of the basement of one of the Big Four. There's always been a time in the Big Four and the accounting industry where people didn't want to work. There's always been people that just wanted to play politics and move up the corporate ladder. So you used to need these paper binder guys or gals to document everything and to chase numbers. If someone wanted to figure out how a financial statement line item tied out to support, or how a tax return number tied out, you had the paper binder and number chasing person go find out how it tied out. Then you had that individual make copies of the support and provide it to the leaders of the group for the meeting. So what has changed since then? Well, people don't need binders anymore. There are audit databases that store all of that audit work or tax work. And there are servers and internal Big Four websites that store tax return work papers. And additionally, many companies don't even use paper anymore to perform their work. Everything is electronic. And even this is pretty recent because even a few years ago, many companies were still using paper. So that's the paper binder person. Now I want to talk about the technology person. This person was also a 60-year-old individual that I worked with. And he labeled himself as a technology guru. And this was mainly because he used technology like his computer and Excel. He didn't have any coding experience or advanced technology expertise, in my view. But back in his day, he was the technology guy. Because back in his day, having to use computers was a hassle and people didn't like technology. They thought it was useless. And also nothing was easy with technology. Systems crashed, Excel crashed, and before Excel there was Lotus 1-2-3, and Lotus 1-2-3 was hard to use and it crashed. So when this guy first started, his bosses likely hated technology. They were used to using paper and calculators, and you could always trust paper and you could always trust calculators. His usage of technology was primarily inputting data. And there used to be a huge need for these type of people because inputting large amounts of data and transactions into systems was a hassle. You had to get paper support and manually type in hundreds of numbers into your systems. And there was tons of paper supported numbers as well in different systems and from different sources that needed to be put into your system and then verified. However, this has changed. There's limited need for data entry anymore. the people that used to value this type of work are retiring. And also, many people know that data entry can now be outsourced or completed by robotic solutions. Another key thing these type of people used to do is pull reports. They would go into systems and generate Excels or PDF reports for management. And depending on the amounts of data and number of reports, this can be a tedious process. And it also depends on how frequently those reports are pulled. If they're pulled quarterly, monthly, daily. So you'd have to wait for that person to pull the reports during working hours. However, reports can now easily be generated and pulled by robots and robotic solutions like Alteryx. And these robots can pull these reports at all hours of the day or night. So for example, a report can be generated at night and waiting on a person's hard drive in the morning, so the need for the old school data entry and report pulling person is dwindling. So as you see from both of these stories, these two older individuals are no longer needed. And that's why I told these two stories. I told these stories to provide insight into why large, mature organizations with older workforces might be more interested in outsourcing their tax departments to companies like the Big Four. Once again, if you want more advice and actionable insights about managed services provided by the Big Four, make sure to check out our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes.
If you need help and guidance through your Big Four recruiting process, make sure to check out our links to our books and courses in the show notes below. For additional Big Four career insights, tips, and tactics, visit our Patreon page, whereas for as little as $1, you could start receiving unique guides and checklists to help you throughout your career. Support us by not only donating to our Patreon page, but also by subscribing to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player today.